Literally looking at my notes to remember that my name is Ian Fahey, and I'm an analytics engineer for the internal DBT Labs data team. I'm going to be the host of this session. The title of the session is Data-Led is Dumb, and we'll be joined by Emilie Schario. Emilie Schario was previously a data strategist at Amplify Partners and has worked on data at Netlify and GitLab. She is based in Columbus, Georgia, close to where I grew up, where she lives with her husband and 2 sons, and she enjoys staring at clouds. Before we jump into things, some recommendations for making the best out of the session. All chat conversations taking place in the Coalesce Data-Led is Dumb channel. If you're not part of the chat, you have time to join right now. Just go to getdbt.com/community and look for the Coalesce Data-Led is Dumb Slack channel when you enter the space. We encourage you to ask other attendees in that space questions, direct questions to that Slack channel even after the talk so that people online can join the conversation. After the session, the speakers will also be available in the Slack channel to answer the questions there. So we encourage you to ask at any point during the session, and your chat champion will assemble them for Emilie's review. So without further ado, let's get started. Over to you, Emilie.
Somewhere, and I don't have it. No, there we go. Well, hey, hi folks. It's so exciting to be here with you all in person today. And hello to the folks who are on camera. I'm with you too. I'm so excited to be presenting today. Thank you so much for carving out a little bit of your conference time to be with me. My name is Emilie Schario, like Ian said, and I'm so happy to be presenting. Today we're going to talk about why this idea of being data-led is dumb. So I mentioned my name is Emilie Schario. My pronouns are she, her. I've worked at a couple different companies. Apparently I have a thing for companies that end with LY recently. You can find me on Twitter pretending to know what I'm talking or trying really hard to be funny. So we're going to talk about a couple of things today. First, what is data-led? What does it mean? What are data's downfalls? And then a better framework for scaling data. So let's jump right into it. The first, hopefully this screen is not familiar to just me. We all probably spend just a little bit too much time watching Netflix. But I'm going to tell you a story, and this story comes via the Wall Street Journal, so I'm going to also put the word allegedly out there because I don't want anyone coming after me. But the way the story goes, there's a show, Grace and Frankie. Has anyone watched it? Okay, I see some heads nodding. So for those of you who haven't watched it, Grace and Frankie is this Netflix show that features Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlinson, who are 2 older white women. And when Netflix was rolling out season 1 of the show back in 2015, they did what Netflix does. They experimented on the cards. We're all familiar with this screen, right? And what Netflix did was they had a bunch of these different cards, some with Lily Tomlinson, some with Jane Fonda, some with them hanging out this way, some that way, doing that thing that they do. They ran this experiment, and what they found was that the cards without Jane Fonda on them performed better. The cards without Jane Fonda, I'm seeing some smiles so people know where this story is going. So the cards without Jane Fonda on them performed better. So if you follow the data, what would you do? Right? If you're optimizing for people to watch season 1 of Grace and Frankie, well, you roll out the cards without Jane Fonda on them, right? You're following the data. You're doing what it's telling you to. But that experiment only optimized for watching season 1 of Grace and Frankie. It didn't optimize for things like the long-term relationship with Jane Fonda. It didn't optimize for whether or not she was going to want to be in season 2 if you rolled out a bunch of cards without her on them. It didn't optimize for whether or not she was ever going to want to work with Netflix again, right? And so the experiment only painted a part of the picture. So, wrong one. Maybe you've heard about this one recently on the news. So if you're unfamiliar with how podcast advertising works, the numbers that podcast hosts report is based on downloads, right? If you're listening to a podcast, people don't actually know how many minutes of that podcast you listen to or a lot about you as a listener specifically. And so podcast hosts and podcasting companies like iHeartRadio report on downloads to their advertisers. So how many people downloaded a podcast? If you download it and never listen to it, or if you download it and listen to it 5 times, it's still just one download. And so Bloomberg reported that podcasts were doing this thing where on video game or like cell phone games, when that pop-up shows up that's like, get 5 more coins for playing this dumb little thing, that was actually triggering a podcast download. So companies' podcast downloads were inflated just by the fact that they had paid for this unique form of advertising, allegedly. And then this one's also been in the news recently. Maybe you've heard of it. But in this merger and acquisition of Discovery and HBO Max, what they were reporting on in their numbers were subscribers, right? The number of subscribers to HBO Max. But has anyone had one of those cell phone plans where it's like you get Disney Plus for free for a year or HBO Max free for a year, right? And so they were not actually reporting the number of subscribers, as in people who had an account. Instead, they were reporting the number of people who were eligible to subscribe, right? And so those are 2 very different numbers, but if you call them subscribers, people don't know the difference, allegedly. So the numbers alone never tell the whole story. They just tell a part of the story. And maybe you've seen this framework before. This is a framework that comes out of Reforge. It's by Crystal Wijaja, I think is how you say her last name. She's former SVP at Gojek, currently Chief Product Officer at Kumu. And she talks about how when you scale data in an organization, you're actually moving from data-informed to data-driven to data-led. But that's a lot of words on a screen, so how does she define data-led? Like this. Data-led company is run by data products, infrastructure, and services. The key business need is the productization of data services that unlock product and data science teams, allowing them to automate operational decision-making and user product experiences. The bolding there is mine. Automate operational decision-making. I don't know about you, but I don't want to work for a company that's automating decision-making off data that we just understood doesn't have the whole story, right? Data helps us understand the state of things, but it doesn't tell everything. It only paints a partial picture. So yes, we want to drive impact with data, but we can't and we shouldn't expect the data to have all of the information. So I present to you today my thesis that being data-led is dumb. There's 3 things we'll talk about here. First, data is only as good as it's instrumented. Second, data lives within a context. And third, data is never the end-all, be-all. So first, data is only as good as it's instrumented. I don't know about you, but I work mostly in B2B SaaS. And so on many occasions, I've had a wonderful salesperson come up to me and say something like, how many of our prospects are using Snowflake as their data warehouse? You could like plug and play the words here to be relevant to you, but basically they ask you a question that you've never answered before. And so you do what any good data person does. You go into the Salesforce data, you look at the opportunities, you try to find a column that might have this information. When you can't find it, you tap the RevOps person on their shoulder and you say, so do we have this information? And they say, no, but I can add a column for you. And so they do exactly that. Actually, they happen to not have anything to do that week, so they do it for you right away. Funny story, yeah, right. And then a week later, that salesperson comes back to you and they say, so, any news? Do you know how many of our prospects are using Snowflake? And you do the analysis, and they pull a number, and it says 20%. But all you've done is capture information for the last week of prospects. You have a much bigger pool of prospects. And so if you take this information and you try to draw broader conclusions from it, you're painting the wrong picture, right? And that's what we mean when we say data is only as good as it's instrumented, is that it only paints a piece of the picture in this case. There are lots of stories of people who implemented tracking on a button. They thought it was on this page, and it was actually that page. Or you didn't realize that the latest release forgot to drop the whatever, and now you don't have any tracking from the iOS app coming in, right? Like, data is only as good as the manual tracking that we put in the first place. And we can't forget that when we're trying to draw broader conclusions from the data. Second, data lives within a context, right? This is Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlinson. For those of you who haven't seen Grace and Frankie, this is one of the cards that they use to promote a later season of the show. And I think this is the best story to paint this picture, right? If you followed the data, if you did what you were supposed to, what the numbers said would optimize for the thing you think you're optimizing for, you would lose the bigger picture. And so we can't follow the numbers at the cost of remembering the bigger picture in which those numbers are created, in the bigger picture in which those numbers exist. In this case, the value of a relationship with Jane Fonda versus just getting streaming views on season 1. The thing about context, too, is that it's one of those words that just could mean a lot of things. And so this is an example that I constantly struggled with in my last role, is that we had accounts had teams, and teams had users, right? And then people would say to me, but how many customers do we have? Which one of those 3 do you mean, right? Or something that if you nerd out on S1s, which is the document that companies file when they're going public, you'll see that they often have to tell you how they define customer for exactly this reason. Some companies, if you sell to a security team and a sales team within the same organization, they count that as 2 customers. I'm not here to pass judgments. They put it in the documents. They're pretty clear on disclosing. But the context matters. And that's a great example of it. Because if you sell LinkedIn to your HR team and the recruiting team and the sales team, yes, that might be 2 contracts, but it's 1 company, right? And so we can't actually forget the context, the bigger information, the bigger story about where and what is going on in the data. And then finally, data is never the end-all, be-all, right? And I like to say all the time that data is just the numerical representation of our organization's processes, right? So yes, that data represents a sign-up, that click event represents a sign-up, but it's still, at the end of the day, a person doing the sign-up. It's still a person signing the contract. So as data practitioners, our goal is to understand what is producing that data, understand the nuances of the production process, and then use that data, which may or may not have been created for analytical purposes, in a way that kind of smooths out the kinks in it. And so maybe if someone signs up on your iOS app, this special segment event doesn't get fired, so you can't use that event to count signups. Or maybe when people sign up, and they have ad blockers on, this is one that people will have dealt with a lot, maybe your event tracker doesn't get them. So when you count signups, you have to do it from your database. But then you can't reconcile them to this other data set that you're working with, right? These are really common problems. But if we think that data is going to have all the answers for us, we forget that, actually the data is really fallible. The data can be right today and wrong tomorrow because someone changed a column name. So in the same way we can't expect the people who produce data to be perfect, we can't expect the data itself to be perfect. In 2019, I wrote this blog post on framework for assessing an organization's data maturity. And I talked about, it's upside down. It's reporting insights predictions. Don't leave your slides to the last minutes, folks. It's reporting insights predictions. I knew something was wrong. Okay, so I wrote this blog post back in 2019 on how this is a framework for assessing an org's data maturity, right? If you're joining a company or you want to understand where a data team is in terms of actually delivering on impact to the business, this is a framework you can use, right? If they're reporting, they're just pushing out numbers. How many customers signed up yesterday? What's our monthly active users? How many people are using our Android app? If you're producing insights, you're combining multiple data sets. What does net retention look like? If people use this new feature we rolled out, how does that affect their overall activation? Things like that. And then finally, predictions. So how do we forecast sales to be? And then earlier this year, I wrote this blog post on the jobs to be done of modern data teams, where I talked about how data orgs generally do these 5 kinds of work: data activation, metrics management, proactive insight discovery, driving experimentation, and interfacing with the data. But these alone don't paint a picture of what it is to have a data org scale within a company. And I think that's where this idea of like data insights, data-driven, well, data-led seems like the right answer. So I'm going to propose something a little bit different. Most data teams start in this service model, right? And someone submits a ticket, and someone else gets a dashboard or a number 3 months later. And in Coalesce, at Coalesce, with Taylor Murphy in the back, in 22 years ago, whatever year that was, we presented on how you should run your data team as a product. And the general thesis of that talk was that it's not enough for us as data practitioners to build the things we're asked for. Instead, we have to understand the problems that people are trying to solve with data so that we can build what needs to get built. And today I'm going to tell you about the third wave, data as operations. So we can't just be number fetchers for others. That's the service model. We can't just build the right thing. That's data as a product. But we have to make sure that the things we do and the things we build and the insights we find actually drive an impact to the business. And that is operations. So when we think about data as operations, it's not enough to just find interesting correlations in the data. One thing people love to do when they're early on in their product analytics journey is figure out what features, what's your Facebook's 10 friends in 7 days, or 7 friends in 10 days, whatever it is, right? What is your thing that people do in the first 24, 48, or hours, 72, that leads to them converting in whatever the appropriate conversion window is? But if you figure that out and then don't do anything with it, what was the point of figuring it out in the first place, right? And so data as operations is about exactly that. It's making sure that the things you're finding, the things you're discovering, are actually being used by the business and driving change. So this is like, sure, what does this mean? And I think this blog post by Adam Stone on Locally Optimistic, where he talks about the data business partnership, is probably the best model for this. Put a little bit differently, it's a matrix org. But if you say that too loud, the startup people come after you. Like, no, we're functional. Yeah, that doesn't really work for data teams, right? The general idea here is that, yes, as data practitioners, we should report to data people. We should have leaders who understand our jobs, who can help us grow our careers, who can mentor us, who can review our PRs, for goodness sakes. But we also need to understand the context of the people we are working with, right? If product is rolling out a new feature, which is what we talk about in just the next slide, we need to understand what the goal of that feature is. So data partnerships themselves are about data being a key part of the workflow, not an afterthought. So Adam, this is a direct quote from that blog post, where he says, and I'm going to read the whole thing, "The product team is thinking about a new feature. Because you've been a partner on this team for a while now, you've been drilling home the importance of predefined success metrics and tracking plans. The PM's already written out a proposed set of success metrics. as designers and engineers scope out the feature, you're close to all of these discussions and start writing out a tracking plan that's aligned with the success metrics. The scope includes this, and the project timeline includes time for implementation. Once the feature is launched, both PM and engineers can pull event counts and build rudimentary visualizations because you've already shown them how to use the company's event analytics tool. Insights come faster, decisions get made with confidence, and everyone wins. Because from the beginning, you have the context. You've worked with people so that the context, so that they also understand the bigger picture of where the value comes from. So when data teams work as operations teams, insights drive impact. Pretty simple, right? So data-led is dumb, because the idea that we can blindly follow data, that any set of numbers is going to have the right answer, that it can exist without the information about how that data came to be or why we have this question in the first place, is silly. We can't separate the numbers from the things in the real world that made it. Like, yes, numbers are great. They're a useful input. But we shouldn't be automating decision-making. We should be giving people the information they need to make the best decisions they can. And that's all I got. Let's keep this conversation going in Slack. I'll be there for the next bit, and then over the next 2 weeks. Thanks so much, folks. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Emily. As a reminder, if you'd like to join the Q&A, please do so in Slack so that we can be inclusive of our online viewers. Thank you all very much, and we will see you in there.